The door to the Senate chamber was already open when I arrived. That was the first insult. They did not bother to make me wait because waiting implies the other person matters. To the Galactic Empire, I did not matter. Neither did the 8 billion people standing behind me. I walked in alone. My name is Asha Mercer. I hold the rank of Commander in the United Earth Defense Directorate, though on paper I was listed as Earth's Chief Diplomatic Envoy. That title was a polite way of saying I was the last person humanity was willing to send before things changed permanently. I had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. I had read every treaty the Galactic Empire had ever imposed on a conquered species. I had memorized every session of the Galactic Senate that touched Earth's name. I knew exactly what this room was designed to do. It was designed to make you feel small. The chamber of the Senate of 1,000 worlds was built inside a hollowed asteroid roughly 4 kilometers across. The ceiling was so high it had its own weather. Pale clouds drifted near the top of the dome, lit from beneath by soft amber light. Around the circular floor, rising in tiers like the inside of a volcano, sat the representatives of over 900 species. Some were tall and thin, with skin like polished stone. Some floated in sealed tanks of liquid. Some were small enough to fit in my coat pocket, and sat on elevated platforms with their own translation devices. All of them were watching me walk to the center of the floor. I did not look up at them. I looked straight ahead. At the far end of the chamber, elevated on a platform carved from a single piece of dark mineral I had never seen on Earth, sat the Grand Arbiter of the Galactic Empire. His name was Consul Draven. He was tall, nearly 3 mm, with a body built like a question mark, and a face that had clearly never carried an expression it did not choose deliberately. He wore the deep green ceremonial robes of his office, and he was looking at me the way a person looks at a small crack in their ceiling. Mildly interesting, probably nothing. Beside him, a junior aide placed a document on the central table. The document was 47 pages long. I had read it 6 times on the journey here. It was called the Voluntary Integration Accord. The word voluntary was doing a great deal of work in that title. The accord would dissolve Earth's directorate. It would transfer all orbital infrastructure, including our stations, our relay networks, and our deep space sensors, to Galactic administrative control. Human citizens would retain the right to petition VEL regional governors for basic resource allocations. We would be permitted to keep our languages, our cultures, and our art, the way a museum keeps old things behind glass. We would exist. We just would not govern ourselves. Consul Draven let the silence stretch for a moment before he spoke. His translator rendered his words into clean, flat English, which was the language he had chosen to use. Another small calculation. He wanted me to hear this in my own tongue. Commander Mercer, he said. Earth has been offered 11 years of patience. The Empire has been generous. Today we conclude this matter. I said nothing yet. I walked to the table and looked at the document around the chamber. There was a low murmur of languages being exchanged. I caught fragments through my earpiece, translated snatches of conversation from the galleries. They were discussing how long the signing would take. One senator from a species called the Vorith was apparently placing a quiet bet on whether I would cry. I picked up the document. I held it for a moment. Then I set it back down and signed and reached into my coat. I placed a single sheet of paper on the table, plain white, printed in simple black text. Earth-made deliberately. Everything about it was ordinary because the message did not need decoration. It read, "Leave Earth's orbit and sovereign space within 30 days, or face the consequences of remaining." That was all. Consul Draven looked at it. He looked at me, and then he laughed. It was a strange sound translated by machine into something close to a human laugh, but with an undertone that made my neck tighten. Around the chamber, other senators joined in, not all of them, but enough to fill the dome with the sound. I stood in the center of that laughter, and I did not move. I thought about a species called the Marath. The Velry had given them a similar choice 22 years ago. The Marath had tried to resist. They had lasted 8 months before their fleet was dismantled, and their leadership was resettled to an imperial administrative planet. They were still there, technically free, technically safe, completely powerless. I thought about the Solon Confederacy. They had not even tried to resist. They had signed on the first day and spent the next decade filing petitions to the regional governors, asking for clean water allocations for their southern settlements. Most petitions were still pending. I thought about 41 other species whose names I had memorized one by one, sitting in my office on Earth, reading files that nobody else wanted to read because the endings were all the same. Then I thought about what Earth had been doing for 11 years, while everyone assumed we were the next name on that list. I let the laughter continue. It took almost a full minute before the chamber settled back into something resembling order. Consul Draven wiped the expression from his face and leaned forward slightly. "Is this a joke, Commander?" he asked. "No," I said. "It is an offer. The same one we would hope you take seriously. Earth has no fleet," he said. "Earth has no alliance. Earth has no leverage. Your orbital stations are under our observation. Your manufacturing output is logged and reviewed quarterly. You have signed 17 preliminary cooperation agreements over the past 11 years. You have no position from which to make demands." I nodded slowly. "That is what the records show," I said. He paused. It was brief, barely a second. But I caught it. The pause of someone who just heard a sentence with a shape they did not quite like. "We will give Earth 72 hours, he said, and his voice had gone flat. "To reconsider, after which the accord will be considered accepted by default, and the transition of administrative authority will begin." I picked up my single sheet of paper from the table. I folded it once and put it back in my coat. "We will not need 72 hours, I said. "Our position will not change." I turned and walked back toward the door. No guard moved to stop me. Nobody called after me. The chamber went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet before. It was the quiet of a room full of intelligent beings who had just heard something they did not know how to categorize. Outside, in the corridor, the young Valeri aide who had placed the accord document on the table was waiting. He was not supposed to be there. He looked at me with wide eyes, a pale green, unusual for his species, which typically ran toward gold. He did not speak. He pressed a small folded note into my hand and then walked quickly in the opposite direction. I waited until I reached the transport bay before I opened it. It had 3 words written in celery script, which my earpiece translated quietly. "They are afraid." I looked at those 3 words for a long moment. Then I put the note in my coat pocket next to the paper with Earth's ultimatum, and I walked to my ship. I had 30 days. So did they. The question was never whether humanity was ready. The question was whether the Valkyrie Empire would believe it before they found out the hard way. I already knew the answer to that question. I had known about it for years, but knowing something and watching it unfold are 2 entirely different things. My ship cleared the Senate Station's docking ring and turned toward open space. Through the forward viewport, I could see the faint blue smear of stars in the direction of home. Earth was 40 light years away. It felt both very far and very close. I sat down in the pilot seat, set the navigation to autopilot, and opened the encrypted channel back to the directorate. The confirmation signal blinked 3 times. Green. Everything was in motion. Whatever the Empire expected to happen next, it was. Not what was coming. And that, I had come to understand, was the only advantage humanity ever truly needed. The first thing I ever learned about the Valkyrie Empire was that they did not believe in secrets. This sounds like a strange thing to say about a civilization that ran an empire across 400 star systems. Empires by their nature keep secrets. They classify information, encrypt communications, and hide the machinery of their power behind layers of bureaucracy and ceremony. But the Valeri kept secrets from the species they ruled within their own ranks, among themselves. They believed that information was power, and that power should be visible. They displayed their fleet numbers in public registries. They published their economic output in annual reports available to any species with access to the Imperial Archive. They announced their military movements in Senate sessions. They did this because they were confident. They did this because they wanted the species under their control to see exactly how large the gap was between what they had and what any resisting planet could hope to build. The message was simple. Look at us. Look at what we have. Now look at yourself. Do not bother. For 11 years, every species in the galaxy looked at Earth and assumed we were receiving that message clearly. We were. We just had a different reaction to it than expected. My name is Asher Mercer, and I am going to tell you what humanity actually did while the Galactic Empire watched our supply manifests and reviewed our quarterly manufacturing reports and congratulated themselves on how thoroughly they had contained us. We listened. The first thing Director Paul Langford did when the Galactic established their observation protocols over Earth's orbital space was to hold a meeting. Not a public meeting, not a Senate session, or a global broadcast. A meeting in a converted basement beneath a civil engineering facility in northern Scotland with 12 people who had been selected not for their rank, but for their specific combination of skills and their demonstrated ability to keep their mouths closed. I was not at that meeting. I was 19 years old and studying aerospace engineering at a university in New Zealand, completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. But I was told about it later in detail by Director Langford himself, sitting in that same basement 11 years on, the week before I flew to the Senate station. He told me that the 12 people in that room had made 3 decisions that night. The first decision was that Earth would appear to comply. Every treaty, every cooperation agreement, every quarterly report would be submitted on time and in good faith. There would be no obvious resistance, no public declarations of defiance. The Galactic would see a planet that had accepted its situation and was slowly, quietly adjusting to life under observation. The second decision was that the real work would happen underground, literally. The Galactic monitored Earth's orbital activity very closely. They had sensor arrays positioned around the planet that tracked energy output, manufacturing emissions, and launch signatures. They had access to our shipping logs and import records. They reviewed everything that went up and everything that came down. They did not, however, have sensors pointed at the ground. They had no instruments capable of reading through 30 memoirs of reinforced earth and stone. They had never developed such technology because it had never occurred to them that a species under observation would build downward instead of up. Within 8 months of the first observation protocols being established, construction began. Deep, slow, patient. Using equipment repurposed from legitimate mining operations, teams of engineers across 6 continents began excavating. The work was logged internally as geological survey projects, groundwater infrastructure, and seismic monitoring network expansions. All of it was real. The cover was built alongside the actual work because the best deception is one that contains genuine truth. Over 11 years, humanity built 73 underground shipyards. 73. The smallest could produce 1 medium-class vessel every 14 months. The largest, located beneath the Canadian Shield in North America, could run 4 simultaneous construction lines. Power came from geothermal taps that had no surface signature. The Valky's orbital sensors could distinguish from natural geological activity. The ships were never launched from Earth. That would have triggered every alarm. Instead, they were built in sections, transported through underground rail systems to coastal access points, loaded onto submersible freight carriers, taken to deep ocean locations, and then carefully transferred through underwater launch platforms that broke the surface for less than 90 seconds per section, always in weather conditions that limited satellite visibility. It took years to develop the process. The first 3 test launches failed. 2 sections were lost. Nobody outside the program ever knew. The engineers adjusted, rebuilt, and tried again. This was the third thing Director Langford and his 12 people decided that night in the Scottish basement. They decided that failure was not a reason to stop. It was information. It told you what needed to change. That philosophy turned out to be the most important weapon humanity had. By the time I walked into the Galactic Senate chamber with a single sheet of paper, Earth had assembled a fleet of 711 warships in deep space beyond the Valkyrie Standard Patrol Range, running on minimal power signatures, holding position in a formation that had been practiced in simulation for 2 years before any ship ever flew it for real. But the ships were only part of it. The second part was the drives. About 4 years into the occupation, a Valori freighter suffered a navigation failure and requested emergency docking at one of Earth's orbital stations. This was not unusual. The station had repair facilities, and under the cooperation agreements, Earth was obligated to provide assistance to Imperial vessels in distress. The freighter was brought in, the crew was housed comfortably, and the repairs took 11 days. In those 11 days, a team of 9 engineers, led by a woman named Dr. Claire, suddenly worked in careful shifts around the clock. They did not touch the freighter's drive core. They did not remove any components. They scanned it with sensors that the Celery did not know Earth had developed, because those sensors had been built underground and never logged in any report. The data from those 11 days of scanning kept a team of 400 engineers busy for 3 years. When they were finished, they understood the Valkyrie drive architecture better than most Valkyrie engineers did. And they had found something that the Empire had not. An inefficiency, a small one. A quirk in the phase alignment sequence that cost about 38% of the drive's potential output. The Celery had been built around it for generations. The way you build around a structural column in a room, you accept it. You design accordingly. You stop seeing it as a problem because it is simply how things are. Dr. Sutton's team did not accept it. They redesigned the sequence from the ground up. When they were finished, the drive configuration they produced was 42% more efficient than the standard Valkyrie model. Our ships could travel farther, faster, on less fuel, with a smaller energy signature. The Vel had given us access to their technology through a mistake. We had returned the ship in perfect condition and said nothing. We thanked them for the opportunity to demonstrate cooperation. We filed the required service report. The third part was information. 11 years ago, the diplomatic delegation Earth sent to the Valkyrie Senate was presented publicly as a gesture of goodwill. A team of 40 representatives traveling on a passenger vessel arrives with prepared statements and a willingness to engage in dialogue about Earth's future within the imperial framework. 38 of those 40 representatives were exactly what they appeared to be. The other 2 were not diplomats. They were systems engineers with backgrounds in signal architecture. During the 6-week journey to the Senate station and the subsequent 12 weeks of diplomatic proceedings, those 2 engineers deployed 41 micro-sensor packages at key points along the route. Each package was smaller than a closed fist. Each one was designed to be completely passive, emitting nothing, simply collecting and storing data about Celery fleet movements, communication traffic patterns, and navigation signatures in nearby space. Over 10 years, those 41 packages collected and compressed an extraordinary amount of information. They were designed to transmit only once in a single short burst, on a frequency the V3 did not monitor, timed to coincide with a natural electromagnetic event that would mask the signal. The transmission took place 14 months ago. The data was received by a relay platform humanity had quietly positioned in deep space 2 years prior. By the time I sat across from Consul in the Senate chamber, Earth strategists had 10 years of Valkyrie fleet position data refined into a complete picture of their patrol patterns, their response times, their strategic reserves, and the precise location of every major military asset in the 3-star systems closest to Earth. We did not just know where their ships were. We knew where they would be. We knew how long it would take them to respond to any given signal. We knew which routes they prioritized and which ones they left lightly covered. We knew exactly where to position our fleet to arrive inside their response window before they could coordinate a coherent reaction. I remembered something my mother said to me when I was 12 years old. She was a geological engineer who had spent her career working on deep infrastructure projects. Later, I understood she was one of the original shipyard construction leads, though she never told me that directly. She told me this: the difference between a wall and a door is not the material. It is the intention of the person who built it. The Valkyrie had built walls around Earth. They had built them with observation protocols and cooperation agreements and resource controls and the very visible presence of their fleet in our orbital space. They had built those walls to contain us. We had spent 11 years quietly installing the door. In the corridor outside the Senate chamber, when that young aide had pressed a note into my hand and disappeared, I had not been surprised. I had been briefed that there were individuals within the Empire's own structure who had concerns about the direction of imperial policy. Not rebels, not spies, simply people who had been watching for long enough to see something that made them uneasy. The note said 3 words: "They are afraid." I thought about that note as my ship moved away from the Senate station. I turned it over in my mind, not for what it confirmed about the Valkyrie, but for what it meant about the next 30 days. Fear in a powerful institution does not always produce good decisions. Sometimes it produces desperate ones. Director Langford had warned me about this. He had said they may comply or they may escalate. Either outcome has been planned for. I trusted that. I trusted the years behind it. But trust and certainty are not the same thing. I had given the Empire 30 days to make a choice. I sat in my ship and I watched the stars, and I thought about every engineer, every scientist, every soldier, every ordinary person who had worked in silence for 11 years. So that this moment could exist. They had not done it for recognition. Most of them would never be known. The names of the people who built the shipyards and designed the drives and deployed the sensors would not appear in the histories. History would record the fleet and the ultimatum and the outcome. But I knew the real story. The real story was in the hands that built the tools. The real story was 11 years of people choosing every single day to believe that the work mattered, even when nothing around them suggested it was working. That was what the Valkyrie had never measured. That was what their quarterly reports and their observation protocols could never capture. They had watched our output. They had never understood our intention. The navigation system chimed softly. We were approaching the first relay point. I would receive an update on fleet status in a few minutes. I closed my eyes briefly, not to sleep, just to hold the quiet for a moment before everything accelerated. In 30 days, the Empire would make its choice, and everything that happened next would follow from that. One way or the other. I was ready. We were all ready. We had been ready for a very long time. I was in the relay station common room when Admiral Daniel Holt's face appeared on the secure channel and told me the fleet was in position. He did not smile when he said it. Daniel was not a man who celebrated early. I had known him for 6 years, worked under his command for 4 of them. And in all the time I had seen him smile exactly twice. Once when his daughter was born, and once when a simulation we had run 17 times finally came together correctly in the 18th attempt. He was the kind of man who saved his satisfaction for the moment a thing was actually finished. "All 711 confirmed," he said, holding at designated coordinates. "Power emissions minimal, formation integrity at 100%. "And the drone network," I asked, "deployed and calibrated. Every primary Valkyrie military asset in the 3 closest systems has a shadow on it. We have firing solutions ready on 412 targets. Not that we intend to use them." "Not unless we have to," I said. He nodded. "Not unless we have to." The relay station was a modest structure, officially listed as an astronomical research platform. It sat at the edge of the system, far enough from the Senate station to be unremarkable, close enough for me to receive updates in near real time. I had been here for 9 days since the Senate session, waiting, watching the communications traffic from the Empire, which our sensor network monitored continuously. For the first 3 days after I walked out of the chamber, the Imperial communications traffic was what you might expect. Confused, heavy, a lot of encrypted signals moving between the Senate station and the Valkyrie home system. A lot of traffic between regional commanders. The pattern looked like an institution trying to figure out how seriously to take something it had initially dismissed. On the 4th day, the traffic changed character. It became more organized, more directed. The scattered confusion tightened into something with a clear shape. That shape concerned me. I had sent my analysis to Director Langford and to Admiral Holt. Langford had responded with a single line, noted, "Stay the course." Holt had taken longer and sent a full tactical assessment. His conclusion matched mine. A faction within the Empire's military command was not preparing to withdraw. They were preparing to demonstrate that our ultimatum had consequences. Not for them, for us. I was still thinking about that assessment when the alert came in on day 12. 3 V-3Y strike vessels had detached from the Senate Station's military dock, running at high speed on a heading that matched Earth's orbital stations precisely. My hands were very still as I read the report. I had a discipline about stillness that I had learned over years, because stillness was something I could control when very little else was. I read the report twice. Then I opened the channel to Admiral Hall. "I see it," he said before I could speak. "Can we intercept?" "Not without revealing the fleet's position early." "What is their estimated time to Earth's orbital space?" 19 hours at current speed. I did not speak for a moment. 19 hours was not enough time to evacuate the stations. We had protocols for moving personnel to interior sections, for activating shield systems, for positioning emergency response vessels. But the stations themselves could not be moved. "Daniel," I said, "what do you recommend?" He was quiet for a second. "I recommend we move the fleet to the Senate Station now, not as a threat, as a fact. Let them see it before those strike vessels reach Earth stations. Give them a chance to recall the ships. If they do not recall them, then we respond to whatever they do with measured precision. No wider engagement. Specific targets only." I thought about Director Langford's words. Both outcomes have been planned for. I thought about the 41 species in my files, every one of them waiting to see what happened to Earth. "Do it," I said. Admiral Holt cut the channel. Minutes later, 711 human warships dropped out of low-power holding mode simultaneously and jumped to the coordinates we had calculated from 10 years of Valkyrie fleet movement data. The jump placed them in V3 space at a distance of 40,000 kilometers from the Senate Station, in a formation that had been designed specifically to be seen clearly on every sensor array the station possessed. I switched to a live feed from one of our remote observation drones near the station. The formation held perfectly. 711 ships in concentric rings, outer to inner, each ring angled slightly to maximize visual impact on long-range sensors. Not aggressive, not pointed at the station, simply present, simply visible, simply there in a place that was supposed to be impossible for Earth to reach. The Senate Station's active sensor array lit up like a struck bell. I could read the response signatures from my feed. They were scanning, counting, scanning again, because the number did not match anything in their models of what Earth could possibly have. I switched to the Senate Communications channel, which our network could monitor in real time. The chamber was in session. It had apparently been in an emergency session for the past 4 days. I did not have audio for the first 6 seconds after the fleet appeared on their sensors. Then the translator in my earpiece caught up with the incoming signal and I heard the chamber. It was not composed. There were dozens of voices overlapping, speaking over each other in multiple languages that the translation system was working hard to parse. I caught fragments. The words "impossible" and "not in the registry" and "where did they come from" and "check the coordinates again" came through clearly in different languages from different representatives. I let it run for 90 seconds. Then I opened the direct channel to the Senate chamber that I had been given as Earth's accredited envoy. "Consul Draven," I said. The chamber went quiet so fast it was almost physical. "This is Commander Mercer. I wanted to make you aware that Earth's fleet is now in position. I would also like to make you aware that 3 of your strike vessels are currently on a course toward Earth's civilian orbital stations. I am asking respectfully that you recall those ships." Silence. Then Draven's voice was flatter than I had ever heard it. "How?" It was not really a question. The word just came out of him. "You studied what we were," I said. "We studied what we could become." Another silence longer. "Those vessels," he said slowly, "are operating under orders from the military directorate, not from my office. I understand that. I said. Recall them anyway. There was a sound in the background of the channel, something being moved or dropped. Then Draven's voice came back, and underneath the flatness, there was something else. Now, something I had not heard from him before. If I issue the recall, it will be seen as a concession, he said. It will be seen as a decision, I said. There is a difference. Another pause, the longest yet. I watched the drone feed. The fleet held formation. Not one ship had moved. Not one weapon had powered up. We were simply there, enormous and patient, a fact that the Senate station sensors could not unsee. The ships, Draven said quietly, will be recalled. I heard the order went out on a secondary channel. Authentication codes, command sequence, directional transmission. 14 minutes later, the 3 strike vessels altered course. They did not return to the station. They held at a neutral distance, as if their commanders were not yet ready to fully accept what had just happened. That was fine. Partial movement was still movement. In the Senate chamber, the noise had changed from chaos to something more controlled. Representatives were conferring with each other. The initial shock had passed, and now the calculation was beginning. Every species in the chamber was recalibrating their understanding of Earth, adjusting a model they had built over 11 years based on information that was no longer accurate. That recalibration was important. It was not just about the V3. It was about every species watching. I had thought about this a great deal over the years. The Valkyries' greatest tool was not their fleet or their resources. It was the belief of every species under their control that resistance was impossible. That belief was self-sustaining. If you could not imagine a way out, you stopped looking for one. If you stopped looking, you confirmed the Empire's model of you, and the cycle continued. Watching 711 human ships appear, where no ships from a controlled planet had ever appeared before. The species in that chamber were not just seeing Earth's fleet. They were seeing a crack in something they had believed was solid. I did not have time to think about the full weight of that. The situation was still unresolved. The fleet was visible, but the Valkyrie Military Directorate was a separate power center from the Senate, and they had their own communications channels and their own chain of command, and they had not been the ones who recalled those strike vessels. Draven was the Senate. The Senate and the Military Directorate had not always agreed. That was a problem for the next 36 hours. But for this moment, looking at the feed, watching the formation hold, watching the strike vessels sit at a neutral distance without continuing their course toward Earth, I allowed myself one quiet thought. It was working, not finished, not won, but working. The fleet had not fired a single weapon. We had shown up, held still, and asked a question with our presence that the Empire could not easily answer. That was the plan. That was always the plan, not destruction. Presence, the kind of presence that changes the calculation permanently, whether the other side chooses to accept it or not. The attack came at 0340 station time, while most of the relay post crew was asleep. I was not asleep. I had not managed more than 2 hours in the past day and a half. I was at the monitoring console when the alert came in, and I read it 3 times in the space of about 4 seconds, because my mind initially could not process what it was showing me. The 3 very strike vessels that had been recalled had not stayed recalled. Somewhere in the 19 hours between Council Dragon's order and the moment I was reading this report, a counter-order had come from the Military Directorate, a separate authorization, a separate chain of command that had simply overridden the Senate's recall signal and sent the ships back on their original heading. They had not gone for Earth's defense infrastructure. They had not targeted the military platforms or the relay networks or the sensor arrays. They had targeted the civilian habitat rings. 3 of them, the oldest ones, are positioned in Earth's mid-orbital band, each housing between 10 and 17,000 residents, workers, families, researchers, support staff. By the time the alert reached me, it was already over. I sat at that console for a long time without moving. The reports came in sequence. Habitat Ring 7, Ring 12, Ring 19, the structural reports, the emergency response activation logs, the initial casualty estimates which changed 3 times in the first hour as search teams updated their data. 41,214. That number settled and stopped changing around 0520. I had a habit when I received difficult information of saying the numbers out loud to myself, quietly, barely a whisper, not for anyone else. For myself to make sure I'd actually taken the information in, rather than letting it slide past the surface of my mind like water off a cold surface. The human brain under extreme stress can become very good at almost understanding something without fully absorbing it. I had learned over years to push through that. 41,214. I said it once, and then I sat with it. On the monitor, Admiral Holt's channel request was blinking. I let it blink for 30 seconds before I answered. When his face appeared, it was completely controlled. The way a person's face looks when they are controlling it very deliberately. "You have seen the casualty report," he said. "Yes, I am waiting for your instruction." Around the fleet, I knew every commander was waiting for the same thing. In situations like this, waiting can feel like an action. It is not waiting in a moment of extreme emotion when every instinct is telling you to respond immediately, is one of the hardest and most important things a military force can do. It is the difference between a response and a reaction. A reaction follows emotion. A response follows strategy. Director Langford had been very clear on this point in our final briefing. He had said, "If they strike civilians, and they may, your first task is not to act. Your first task is to not act incorrectly." I breathed in. I breathed out. "Daniel," I said, "the military directorate gave that order without Senate authorization. Is that confirmed?" "Confirmed." We intercepted the command chain. It originated from the fleet commander's veil directly. Draven's office was not in the loop, so the Senate and the military directorate are no longer operating as a single voice. It appears so. That was significant. Not immediately comforting, but significant. The Empire's internal coherence was fracturing. The military wing had decided to act unilaterally because they believed the Senate's approach was too cautious. They believed a demonstration of force against civilian targets would collapse Earth's resolve the way it had collapsed others before us. They were not entirely wrong about the history. Several species in the Imperial Registry had capitulated specifically after civilian station strikes. The loss of life had been devastating, and the immediate concern for surviving populations had outweighed the longer-term strategy. The military directorate had run the calculation on Earth using the same model they had used every time before. The model was wrong. Not because humans do not feel loss. We feel it deeply. The 41,000 names on that report were not an abstraction to me. They were people who had woken up that morning with plans, people who had eaten breakfast, sent messages to family members on the surface, argued about small things, looked out their habitat viewports at the familiar curve of Earth below them. They had lives that were full and ordinary and specific, and now they were gone, and the specific weight of that was real and heavy, and I was carrying it. But the military directorate had assumed that weight would produce paralysis. They had assumed it would produce the kind of grief that turns inward and makes people desperate to stop the pain by accepting whatever terms ended the crisis. They did not understand something fundamental about the way humans respond to loss of this kind. We do not become less determined. We become more precise. "Daniel," I said, "executes the response protocol for logistics only. No military personnel facilities, no habitat structures, no ships currently in port, infrastructure only." He nodded once. "Confirmed. Protocol 4. Over the next 6 hours, Earth's fleet executed the most methodical and precisely constrained military operation in our short history of deep space combat. We hit 23 targets. All of them were supply infrastructure. Celery logistics depots, fuel processing stations, automated cargo transfer points, and communication relay installations. Each target was struck with minimum necessary force to disable it. Not destroy, disable. The Valkyrie military machine went deaf and hungry in 6 hours without a single crew member on either side being harmed by our action. We hit exactly what we said we would hit, and nothing else. This was as important as hitting anything at all because the species in the Galactic Senate were watching. The species in the Empire's outer territories were watching. The freed worlds that had spent years under Imperial administration were watching. They were watching to see whether humanity, having been struck in the way the Empire had struck before, would respond with the same unconstrained force the Empire had always used. Whether we would prove that power, regardless of who holds it, always behaves the same way in the end. We did not. 16 hours after our operation concluded, something happened that our planning had hoped for, but had not guaranteed. A signal came in on an open frequency, not encrypted, not directed specifically at Earth, broadcast into open space, receivable by any vessel or installation within range. It was from the Sorin Collective, a species in the Empire's outer territories who had been under administration for 31 years. Their signal was brief, a formal statement read in their own language with a translation appended. It said that the Sorin Collective had observed Earth's ultimatum, Earth's fleet, and Earth's response to the habitat strike. It said that the Sorin Collective wished it to be formally noted that they considered Earth's actions proportionate and Earth's position legitimate. It said that they were filing a formal grievance against the Imperial Military Directorate for the civilian station strike and requesting that the Galactic Senate investigate. 2 hours later, a second signal came in. Different species, same open frequency. Then a third. By the end of the day, 11 separate outer territory species had broadcast similar statements. Not declarations of alliance with Earth specifically, not requests for military protection, simply formal public statements that they were watching and that they wanted the record to show where they stood. I had not known this was going to happen. Director Langford had thought it was possible. He had told me about the quiet work that had been going on alongside the shipyard construction and the sensor deployment and the drive research. For 9 years, Earth had been using every contact point the cooperation agreements provided to build something that did not appear in any military registry. Relationships, small ones, quiet ones. A celery freighter crew that Earth Station had treated exceptionally well during an emergency repair. Returning crew members who went home and told their families about the humans who had been more courteous than any Imperial official they had ever dealt with. A medical supply shipment that Earth had routed to a Sorin Collective settlement suffering from an outbreak using a loophole in the cooperation agreements that allowed humanitarian cargo. Refugees from a displaced species called the Thras, who had requested temporary settlement on Earth and had been welcomed, housed, and educated for 6 years before the Empire's relocation order came through, and who had left carrying something they did not expect to find on a controlled planet. The memory of being treated as if they mattered. None of that appeared in our fleet strength calculations. None of it showed up in the sensor data or the drive efficiency numbers, but it was there. It had been building for years. And now, when the Valeri Military Directorate had done the one thing most likely to harden every watching species against them, all of that quiet work was producing visible results. Consul Draven requested a direct channel to me at 18:30 station time. I accepted it immediately. He looked different, not physically. The tall, composed figure in ceremonial robes was the same. But there was something behind his eyes that had not been there in the Senate chamber when he was laughing at my piece of paper. Something that I recognized because I had seen it in human faces during difficult negotiations. He was calculating survival, not personal survival, institutional survival. He was trying to figure out whether the structure he had spent his career serving still had a viable future. "Commander Mercer," he said, "I want to ask you a direct question." "Go ahead." "Why," he said, "when you had 700 warships positioned outside the station with firing solutions on 400 military targets, did you wait? Why did you not simply act?" I looked at him for a moment. The question was genuine. It was not a diplomatic opener or a tactical probe. He genuinely wanted to understand because the choice was always yours to make. I said taking the choice away would have told every species in this Senate that we are the same as the Empire, that whoever has the bigger fleet gets to decide. We did not want to say that. We wanted to say something different. And what he asked slowly, did you want to say? I thought about the 41,000. I carried them with me into the answer. That there is another way to organize a galaxy, I said, and that Earth is willing to help build it, but not while the Empire has its hands around our throat. Dravon was quiet for a very long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The formality was still there, but underneath it, something had shifted. The military directorate, he said carefully, has overstepped its authority on multiple occasions. There is a process for addressing that within our governance structure. It has not been used in several decades because it has not been necessary. I understood what he was telling me. It may be necessary now, I said. He inclined his head slightly. It may be. He closed the channel. I sat back and looked at the drone feed. The fleet was still there, still holding formation, still not pointing anything at anything. Outside the Senate station, space was quiet. But inside it, I suspected things were moving very quickly. The next 48 hours would determine everything. And for the first time since I had walked into the chamber with a single piece of paper, I allowed myself to feel something other than focused concentration. Not victory, not yet, but possibility. Real, genuine, unguarded possibility. It felt unfamiliar. After 11 years, unfamiliar was the right word for it. I held on to it carefully. The way you hold something fragile that you have waited a long time to find, and I waited to see what the morning would bring. 22 days after I placed Earth's ultimatum on the table of the Galactic Senate, Council Dravon called for a full emergency session of the Senate of 1,000 Worlds. It was the first time in 140 years that such a session had been called by the Senate's own presiding authority, rather than being requested by the Imperial Military Directorate. The distinction mattered enormously, though I suspected most of the representatives filling the chamber that morning did not fully appreciate why. I did. I had spent a week reading everything I could find about the Senate's governing charter, and I understood exactly what it meant that Dravon had used his own authority to call the session rather than waiting for the military directorate to set the agenda. It meant the Senate was reclaiming its voice. I was in the observer's gallery rather than the chamber floor. My formal envoy status had been suspended 3 days earlier by the military directorate, which had declared my presence on the station a security concern. Dravon had not contested that suspension publicly, but he had quietly arranged for my relay station access to be extended and for a sealed observer pass to be issued under a different administrative category. It was the kind of bureaucratic maneuvering that a person could only do if they understood the system they were working within deeply and had spent decades inside it. I watched the session from behind a glass panel with my earpiece providing real-time translation. The chamber looked different at full session. Every tier was occupied. Species I had only read about were present in forms I had never seen outside a biological reference archive. There was a species from the outer territories called the Velner Narim, who communicated through color shifts in their translucent skin and required a specialized interpreter system to participate in vocal language sessions. They had not attended a full emergency session in 40 years. According to the records, they were here now. The young aide who had passed me the note on the first day was standing at the edge of the floor near the document tables. His name was Kalin. I had learned this during the past week. He was 26 years old by Valerie, counting which translated to roughly 19 in Earth years. He had served in the Senate administrative staff for 3 years. Before that, he had studied comparative governance at a university on the Valkyrie homeworld, where according to people who knew him then, he had written a thesis arguing that the Empire's integration policies were economically self-defeating over timescales longer than 50 years. His thesis had received a passing grade and a note from his evaluator recommending he pursue a career in a less theoretical field. He was standing very straight. His pale green eyes were watching the chamber floor with an expression I recognized because I had worn something like it myself many times. It was the expression of someone watching something important happen and trying to memorize it. The consul opened the session without ceremony. He did not give a speech. He presented in precise and measured terms a formal accounting of the events of the past 22 days. He did not editorialize. He did not frame the events as a victory or a defeat for anyone. He simply stated what had happened in sequence with the documentation attached. Earth's ultimatum, the Senate's initial response, the fleet's appearance, the recall of the strike vessels, the military director's counter-order, the civilian habitat strike, the casualty figures, Earth's response operation and its specific scope, the outer territory statements, the internal governance process he had initiated regarding the military director's unauthorized actions. It took 40 minutes to read into the record. The chamber was completely quiet for all of it. When he finished, he opened the floor for representative statements. What followed was 4 hours of debate that I could not have scripted if I had tried. Species that had not spoken out in the Senate session in years were speaking. Not all of them in Earth's favor. Several representatives made pointed arguments that Earth's fleet deployment was itself an act of aggression, that a planet under integration protocols had violated its cooperation agreements by concealing military construction, and that regardless of the circumstances, the principle of imperial authority needed to be upheld, or the entire framework of interstellar governance would unravel. These were not bad arguments. I listened to them carefully, and I took them seriously because easy dismissal of an opponent's best points is how you fail to understand them. But then other voices came forward. A representative from the Sorin Collective spoke for 12 minutes about 31 years of governance under imperial administration. She did not speak angrily. She spoke with the particular patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time for a room to be ready to listen. She described what resource allocation petitions looked like in practice. She described what happened to species that filed complaints. She described the way that integration over decades did not simply change how a species was governed, but changed how they thought about themselves. She said, "We began to believe that our smallness was a fact of nature, rather than a condition that had been imposed on us." The chamber was very quiet when she finished. After her, a representative of a species called the Doran spoke. The Doran had been integrated 60 years ago. Their representative was elderly, speaking through a translation system that had a slight lag. He said that watching Earth's fleet appear in Veluri space had been the first moment in 60 years that he had allowed himself to imagine something he had long since stopped imagining. He did not say what that something was. He did not need to. Every species in the chamber that had ever been told to stop imagining understood. Admiral Holt updated me during a brief recess that the fleet was maintaining position and that there had been no new movement from any Valkyrie military assets. The military directorate had gone very quiet after Dravon initiated the internal governance process, which apparently carried significant constitutional weight that even the military chain of command could not easily override. Whatever was happening within the directorate's own command structure, it was happening without public signals. When the session resumed, Draven put 4 formal motions to the chamber. The first motion called for the immediate cessation of all Imperial military operations in Earth's orbital space and the surrounding zone pending the outcome of the session's proceedings. The second motion called for the formal suspension of the military directorate's authority over non-military affairs pending a constitutional review of the unauthorized civilian station strike. The third motion called for the establishment of a special committee to review the terms of all current integration accords with outer territory species, with particular attention to resource allocation processes and petition review timelines. The fourth motion called for the convening of a full charter convention to discuss for the first time in the Senate's history the structure of representation in interstellar governance. The voting took 2 hours, not because the votes were close on all 4. Some were not close at all. The first motion passed by a margin that surprised even me. The fourth motion was the most contested and passed by a narrow but clear majority. When Draven announced the final result of the fourth vote, the chamber made a sound I had not heard from it before. It was not applause exactly. Different species express things differently. But there was a collective shift in the room, a change in energy that registered even through the glass of the observer's panel. I sat still for a moment, with my hands in my lap, and my eyes on the chamber floor. Director Langford had told me in our last conversation before I flew to the Senate station, "The best outcome is not the one where we win. The The best outcome is the one where winning means something different to everyone afterward. I thought he might be satisfied with today. After the session concluded, Kalen found me in the corridor outside the observer's gallery. He had clearly been waiting for me to come out. He was holding a data tablet, and he looked like someone who had made a decision about something and was not entirely sure it was correct. "Commander Mercer," he said, "I wanted to speak with you if you have a moment." "I have time," I said. He fell into step beside me as I walked toward the transport bay. "I wanted to apologize," he said, "for the note. It was improper for someone in my position to pass information to a foreign envoy." "The information was 3 words," I said, "and it was accurate. It was still improper." He paused. "But I believed it was more important for you to know than for me to maintain propriety." "Why?" I asked. Not to challenge him. I genuinely wanted to hear his answer. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I wrote a thesis at university," he said, arguing that the Empire's policies were unsustainable over long time scales. And I had spent 3 years in this building watching decisions be made that confirmed everything I had written, and nobody was in a position to act on it. "And you thought I might," I said. "I thought you already were," he corrected me. "I just wanted to make sure you knew the information was useful to someone on our side." Our side. It was an interesting phrase from a Valerie Senate aide. I stopped walking. "Kalen," I said. He looked slightly startled that I knew his name, but recovered quickly. "The charter convention that was voted on today will need representatives from across the Senate's member species, including species that have not traditionally had strong voices in how this body operates." I looked at him steadily. "It will also need people who understand the existing governance structures well enough to identify where they need to change and how to make those changes in ways that actually hold." He was looking at me carefully. "I understand the existing structures," he said slowly. "I know," I said. "I read your thesis. Our intelligence team forwarded it to me 2 weeks ago." He stared at me. "You read my thesis, the governance section specifically. The part about petition review timelines was very well argued." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, to his credit, he did not try to downplay it or make a modest objection. He simply said, "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that when the Special Committee for the Charter Convention is formed, Earth will be nominating representatives, and that Earth would like one of those representatives to be someone with deep knowledge of this institution, who also has a demonstrated commitment to the principle that governance should serve the people it governs." I paused. That person would need to be willing to work alongside representatives from many different species, including humans, for what will likely be several years. He was very still. "I am Valerie." "I know," I said. "That is precisely why it matters that you do it." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the floor, then back at me. "I would need to resign my current position." "Yes," I said. "You would?" He nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself that he had already known. "I will think about it." "Take the time you need," I said. I left him in the corridor and continued to the transport bay. The shuttle that would take me back to the relay station was already prepped. I boarded, settled into the seat, and looked out the viewport as the Senate station grew smaller behind me. Admiral Holt's channel connected automatically once I was clear of the station's communication shadow. "The session results have been confirmed across the fleet." He said commanders are awaiting final orders regarding position. "Begin the withdrawal to the agreed boundary." I said not full withdrawal. "Agreed boundary only as per the ceasefire terms confirmed, and the drone network. Maintain it, not as a threat, as a record. If anyone has questions about what happens in celery space over the next 6 months, we want the answers to be available." He nodded. "Understood." "Daniel," I said, "when this is over, take some time. You have earned it." He looked at me, and then for the second time in the 6 years I had known him, he smiled. It was brief and genuine, and it suited him. "When it is over," he said. "Not yet." "Not yet," I agreed. The shuttle moved away from the station. Through the viewport, the fleet was visible at the edge of my visual range. 711 ships began to shift from their holding formation toward the boundary coordinates, moving with the same precision they had held for 3 weeks. They had not fired a weapon in anger. We had conducted one specific operation against specific targets with specific constraints. 23 infrastructure targets, 0 crew casualties. And the Empire, the organization that had maintained control over 400 star systems for 200 years, through the simple projection of overwhelming force and the certainty that resistance was impossible, was now holding a charter convention. Because a planet they had never taken seriously had spent 11 years becoming something they could not dismiss. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. 41-214. I said the number one more time quietly to myself. I would always say it. I would say it for the rest of my life at moments like this one. When the distance between what had been lost and what had been gained tried to sort itself into something simple, it never would sort into something simple. That was correct. It should not. The people on those habitat rings had not been part of the military program. They had not been soldiers or engineers or diplomats. They had been ordinary people living ordinary lives in a place that became dangerous because a powerful institution decided to demonstrate something. Their loss was not a price that anyone had agreed to pay. It was something that had happened to them. And the only thing that could be done in response was to make sure that the thing they had been caught in, the structure that had made their deaths possible, was changed in ways that mattered. That was what the Charter Convention was for. Not revenge, not monument. Change. Real, slow, difficult, contested, imperfect change that would take years and would face resistance at every step and would require people like Kalen to walk into rooms full of people who did not yet trust each other and build something. Anyway, the relay station appeared ahead, small and steady against the stars. I thought about Director Langford in that Scottish basement 11 years ago. 12 people. One decision to try. I thought about Dr. Claire Sutton and her team of engineers scanned a freighter drive for 11 days and then spent 3 years turning the data into something new. I thought about the construction teams underground, the submersible freight operators, the sensor engineers, the pilots who had practiced the formation drill 17 times before they got it right. I thought about a woman in the outer territories who had waited 31 years to say in a full Senate session that her people had been taught to believe their smallness was natural. I thought about the look on the faces in the chamber when she finished speaking. Director Langford had said, "The best outcome is the one where winning means something different to everyone." Afterward, the shuttle docked. I unstrapped, stood, and walked to the station's main corridor. Through the observation window, the stars were steady and clear and enormous, the way they always are when you have been looking at a screen for too long and then look up and remember the actual scale of things. I stood at that window for a while. I thought about the question Council Dragon had asked me in the Senate chamber on that first day, the one he had not asked out loud, but had communicated with his laughter and his certainty and his very deliberate use of my own language. He had asked, "Who do you think you are?" It had taken 11 years, 3 weeks, and 41,000 losses to give the complete answer. But I knew what it was. We were the species that, when told a wall was permanent, had quietly built a door. We were the species that, when given 11 years of observation, had used them to learn, to build, to connect, and to prepare. We were the species that, when the moment came to demonstrate what we had built, had chosen to open with patience rather than force, and held to that choice even when force was used against us. We were not perfect. We had never claimed to be. The galaxy would find out over time all the ways in which humans were flawed and difficult and contradictory and capable of getting things deeply wrong. That was fine. That was accurate. Perfection was never the point. The point was the door. The point was that we had built it and we had opened it, and we had invited anyone willing to walk through it to come and build something on the other side together. Earth was 40 light years away. It was the most ordinary-looking planet in its section of space. Blue mostly, a bit of white cloud, a lot of ocean, unremarkable from a distance, which was the way most remarkable things look from far enough away. It was full of people who had made engines in the dark and launched ships in secret and waited with extraordinary patience for a moment that might never have come. It had come. The Charter Convention would begin in 4 months. It would be the first interstellar governance gathering in history where every species present had an equal seat. It would be chaotic and slow and frustrating and occasionally brilliant. And it would produce results that nobody fully predicted, and everybody would have opinions about. Humanity would participate in it the same way we had participated in the last 11 years, fully carefully. With our eyes open and our hands ready for work, I turned away from the window and walked toward the communications room to begin drafting the report to Director Langford. There was a great deal to say, and for the first time in a very long time, all of it was true, and most of it was hopeful, and none of it was small. I sat down at the desk, pulled up the secure channel, and began.